What started as a routine late-night interview turned into television chaos when beloved actor Pedro Pascal confronted Jimmy Kimmel over deeply personal comments, leading to an explosive on-air meltdown that has Hollywood reeling. The studio lights dimmed as the familiar opening music of Jimmy Kimmel Live echoed through the packed audience. Tonight's guest was Pedro Pascal, fresh off his critically acclaimed performances in The Last of Us and The Mandalorian, riding high on a wave of universal adoration from fans worldwide. The audience erupted in cheers as Pascal walked onto the stage, his trademark warm smile lighting up the room as he waved to the crowd with genuine appreciation. Jimmy Kimmel, sporting his usual smirk, stood behind his desk with an air of calculated confidence. The initial greeting seemed cordial enough, with Pascal settling into the guest chair as the applause died down. But those familiar with Kimmel's interviewing style could sense something brewing beneath the surface, that particular gleam in his eye that often preceded his more controversial moments. "Pedro, Kimmel began, leaning back in his chair with exaggerated casualness. "The man of the hour, the internet's daddy, as they say." The audience chuckled, but Pascal's smile faltered slightly at the choice of words. Kimmel continued, without missing a beat. "You know, I've been reading about your recent comments regarding your support for various political causes, and I have to say, it's interesting how Hollywood actors always seem to think their opinions matter more than regular people's." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Pascal's posture stiffened, his hands clasping together as he processed what had just been said. "I'm sorry, what exactly are you referring to, Jimmy?" Pascal asked, his voice maintaining its characteristic gentleness but with an edge that hadn't been there moments before. Kimmel shuffled through some papers on his desk, clearly having prepared for this moment. "Oh, you know, your passionate posts about immigration, your vocal support for refugees, all very noble, very Hollywood of you. But I'm curious, and the audience probably is too, how does it feel to lecture Americans about opening borders when you live in a gated community in the Hollywood Hills?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to spread. Pascal's jaw tightened visibly, and several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the light-hearted banter they'd expected from what was supposed to be a promotional interview for Pascal's upcoming projects. "Jimmy, I think there might be some confusion here," Pascal replied, his voice steady but his eyes beginning to flash with something that looked dangerously close to anger. "My advocacy for human rights isn't about lecturing anyone. It's about using whatever platform I have to speak up for people who don't have a voice. And frankly, I find it pretty disappointing that you'd characterize compassion as hypocrisy." Kimmel's smirk widened, sensing he'd struck a nerve. "Compassion, sure, but let's be honest here, Pedro. You grew up in Chile, moved to the United States, built a career here, became wealthy and successful. The American dream, right? But now you're telling Americans they're not doing enough for immigrants. Isn't that a little rich?" The audience had gone completely silent now, the energy in the room shifting from excitement to tension, so thick you could cut it with a knife. Pascal's knuckles were white as he gripped the arms of his chair, and his breathing had become noticeably deeper. Those who knew Pascal's personal history, his family's escape from Pinochet's regime in Chile, the struggles his parents faced, as refugees themselves, could see this wasn't just political disagreement anymore. This was personal. "Let me get this straight," Pascal said, his voice dropping to a lower register that those familiar with his dramatic work would recognize as a warning sign. "You're questioning my right to speak about immigration because I'm an immigrant myself? Because my family fled a dictatorship when I was a child? Because we know what it's like to need help and not know if it's coming?" Kimmel seemed to realize he might have pushed too hard, but rather than backing down, he doubled down. "I'm just saying, it's easy to be generous with other people's money, other people's resources. You're not the one dealing with the consequences of these policies in Middle America." That's when Pedro Pascal's famous composure finally began to crack. his eyes blazing with an intensity that made the studio audience collectively hold their breath, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented unfold before their very eyes. Pascal leaned forward in his chair, the movement deliberate and measured, like a predator preparing to strike. "Jimmy," he said, his voice carrying a deadly calm that somehow felt more threatening than shouting, "I need you to understand something right now. My father was tortured under Pinochet's regime. My mother carried me across borders, not knowing if we'd live to see the next day. So when you sit there with your smug little grin and suggest that I don't understand the real consequences of immigration policy, you're not just attacking my politics, you're spitting on my family's trauma." The color drained from Kimmel's face as the weight of Pascal's words hit the room like a physical force. Several audience members gasped audibly, while others began murmuring among themselves. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every micro-expression, every moment of this rapidly escalating disaster. Kimmel, clearly realizing he'd stepped into dangerous territory but unable to find a graceful exit, attempted damage control with his trademark deflection humor. "Whoa, whoa, Pedro. I think you're taking this a little too seriously. We're just having a conversation here. This is supposed to be fun, remember?" The word fun seemed to act like gasoline on an already burning fire. Pascal's hands began to shake slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of containing his rage. "Fun," he repeated, his voice rising for the first time. "You think discussing my family's suffering is fun? You think turning my appearance on your show into some kind of political ambush is entertaining?" The studio fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the quiet hum of cameras and the nervous shuffling of feet. Even Kimmel's usually reliable band seemed frozen, unsure whether to intervene or simply witness what was unfolding. The talk show host, perhaps sensing he was losing control of the situation entirely, tried to regain his footing by appealing to the audience. "Folks, I think our guest here is having a bit of an overreaction," Kimmel said, turning to the crowd with an uncomfortable laugh. "I mean, we ask tough questions of all our guests. That's what journalism is about, right?" But the audience wasn't buying it. The energy in the room had shifted completely, and many were now looking at Kimmel with obvious disapproval. Someone in the back rows shouted, "Leave him alone, Jimmy," which was quickly followed by scattered applause and murmurs of agreement. Pascal stood up abruptly, towering over Kimmel's desk, with an imposing presence that filled the entire set. His chest was heaving with controlled breathing, and his eyes had taken on a steely quality that anyone who'd watched The Last of Us would recognize from his most intense, dramatic moments. "You want to talk about journalism, Jimmy? Real journalism involves research, empathy, and respect for your subjects. What you're doing isn't journalism, it's cruelty disguised as entertainment." Kimmel's confidence was visibly cracking now, beads of sweat forming on his forehead as he realized the interview had spiraled completely beyond his control. His usual arsenal of jokes and deflections seemed pathetically inadequate against Pascal's raw, authentic emotion. "Pedro, maybe we should take a commercial break and—" "No!" Pascal cut him off sharply, his voice echoing through the studio with commanding authority. "We're not taking a break. You wanted to have this conversation on live television, so let's have it. You want to question my credibility? Fine. But let me tell you what credibility actually looks like." The actor began pacing behind his chair, his movements fluid but charged with barely contained energy. "Credibility is using your platform to lift people up, not tear them down. Credibility is understanding that when you have millions of viewers, your words have power and consequences. Credibility is treating your guests with basic human dignity, not like props in your political theater." Kimmel attempted to interject. "Pedro, I think you're—" But Pascal wasn't finished. "I came here tonight to talk about my work, to connect with fans, to maybe make people laugh or feel something meaningful. Instead, you've decided to turn this into your personal political soapbox. using my family's pain as your punchline. And you know what the most pathetic part is, Jimmy? The question hung in the air as Pascal stopped pacing and fixed Kimmel with a stare that could have melted steel. The tension now so thick that even the studio cameras seemed to be holding their breath for what was coming next. The most pathetic part is that you think this makes you brave, Pascal continued, his voice carrying across the silent studio like a sword cutting through darkness. You think ambushing guests with personal attacks makes you some kind of hard-hitting interviewer. But real courage, Jimmy, would be using your platform to actually help people instead of tearing them down for cheap laughs and ratings. Kimmel's face had gone from pale to red, a mixture of embarrassment and rising anger. The sweat on his forehead was now clearly visible under the studio lights, and his hands were fidgeting nervously with his note cards. Now wait just a minute, Pedro. I've had enough of this sanctimonious lecture. You Hollywood types are all the same. You can dish it out, but you can't take it when someone challenges your precious worldview. The words were barely out of Kimmel's mouth before Pascal slammed his hand down on the desk with such force that it made everyone in the studio jump. The sound echoed through the space like a gunshot, and several audience members actually flinched backward in their seats. "Don't you dare," Pascal growled, his composure now completely shattered. "Don't you dare try to turn this around on me when you're the one who crossed every line of basic human decency." The studio audience was now completely captivated by the raw display of emotion unfolding before them. Some were pulling out their phones to record, despite the no-recording policy, while others sat frozen in stunned silence. The energy in the room felt electric, dangerous, like lightning about to strike. Kimmel, perhaps finally realizing the magnitude of his mistake, but too proud to back down, made the fatal decision to escalate further. "You know what, Pedro? Maybe the problem isn't my questions. Maybe the problem is that you can't handle being challenged without throwing a tantrum like a spoiled child. This is exactly the kind of entitled behavior that regular Americans are sick of from Hollywood elites." The insult hit Pascal like a physical blow. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, and then something far more dangerous: cold, calculated fury. When he spoke again, his voice was so quiet that the studio microphones had to strain to pick it up. Yet every word carried the weight of a death sentence. "Entitled?" Pascal repeated slowly, savoring each syllable like poison on his tongue. "Let me tell you about entitlement, Jimmy. Entitlement is sitting behind that desk, making millions of dollars, and thinking you have the right to mock the suffering of refugees and immigrants for your audience's amusement. Entitlement is believing that your comedic timing gives you license to weaponize people's trauma." Pascal began walking around the desk, moving with predatory grace toward where Kimmel sat. The host's eyes widened as he realized Pascal was now invading his personal space. The power dynamic of the interview completely reversed. Several crew members stepped forward slightly, unsure whether they should intervene in what was clearly becoming a volatile situation. "You want to know what a spoiled child looks like?" Pascal continued, now standing directly beside Kimmel's chair, forcing the host to crane his neck upward to maintain eye contact. "It's someone who throws around accusations and insults and then acts surprised when there are consequences. It's someone who hides behind 'it's just comedy' when they're called out for being cruel." The audience was completely silent now, watching in fascination and horror as one of Hollywood's most beloved actors systematically dismantled one of late-night television's biggest names. Kimmel's usual confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. "I've been in this industry for decades," Pascal said, his voice gaining strength and clarity with each word. "I've worked with hundreds of hosts, journalists, and interviewers. Some were tough, some asked hard questions, some even disagreed with me politically. But you know what they all had in common? They treated me like a human being. They understood that there's a difference between challenging someone and attempting to humiliate them." Kimmel tried one last desperate attempt to regain control, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. "Pedro, I think you need to calm down, and— Calm down? Pascal's voice exploded through the studio, finally reaching the volume that matched his fury. You ambush me on live television, mock my family's suffering, call me entitled and spoiled, and then have the audacity to tell me to calm down? Who exactly do you think you are? The question reverberated through the studio as Pascal straightened to his full height, looking down at Kimmel with an expression of complete contempt. The host seemed to shrink in his chair, finally understanding that he had awakened something far more powerful than he was prepared to handle. And the reckoning was far from over. Pascal's voice, when it came again, was steady and resolute, carrying the weight of not just his own pain, but the pain of every immigrant, every refugee, every person who had ever been mocked for their struggle. I'll tell you who you are, Jimmy. You're a man who has forgotten that behind every story, every cause, every political position you want to mock, there are real human beings with real pain and real hope. The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the crew members had stopped their usual bustling, everyone transfixed by the raw authenticity of Pascal's words. Kimmel sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, completely unable to formulate any response to the verbal devastation being unleashed upon him. You sit in your comfortable chair, in your safe studio, surrounded by people who laugh at your jokes whether they're funny or not, and you've lost touch with what it means to be vulnerable, to be afraid, to need help, Pascal continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. My family didn't choose to become refugees for your entertainment value. We didn't flee our homeland so that decades later, some talk show host could use our trauma as a setup for his political commentary. The actor took a step back from Kimmel's desk, but his presence still dominated every inch of the studio. You know what the real tragedy is here? You had an opportunity tonight. You had a platform, an audience, a guest who actually cares about making the world better. And instead of using that power to inspire, to educate, to bring people together, you chose to divide. You chose cruelty. Kimmel finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Pedro, I didn't mean for it to go this far. Maybe we can— No, Pascal cut him off with finality. There is no we here. There's no walking this back with a commercial break and a fake apology. You've shown everyone in this room, everyone, watching at home, exactly who you are when the cameras are rolling and you think you have the power. This is who Jimmy Kimmel really is, a man who weaponizes other people's pain for ratings. The audience had begun to murmur among themselves, many nodding in agreement with Pascal's words. Someone shouted, "Tell him, Pedro," from the back rows, followed by scattered applause that grew steadily louder. The energy in the room had completely shifted, with the audience now firmly on Pascal's side and openly showing their disapproval of their host. Pascal looked around the studio, taking in the faces of the crew, the audience, the cameras that were broadcasting this moment to millions of viewers. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of profound sadness mixed with unwavering determination. This industry, this platform you've been given, it's a privilege, not a right. And you've just proven you don't deserve it. The actor began walking toward the edge of the stage, but stopped and turned back for one final devastating blow. You asked me earlier about credibility, about who I think I am to speak on these issues. Well, let me answer that. I'm someone who remembers what it feels like to be powerless. I'm someone who uses whatever influence I have to lift others up, not tear them down. I'm someone who understands that with great platform comes great responsibility. And most importantly, I'm someone who knows when it's time to walk away from people who don't deserve my time or respect. Pascal removed the small microphone pack from his jacket and placed it deliberately on Kimmel's desk with a soft thud that somehow felt louder than any shout. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. He was literally unplugging himself from Kimmel's show, refusing to be part of the spectacle any longer. Ladies and gentlemen, Pascal addressed the audience directly, his voice warm and genuine. For the first time since the interview began, thank you for your support tonight. You deserve better entertainment than this, and you certainly deserve better than having someone's family trauma turned into a punchline for your amusement. The applause that erupted from the audience was thunderous, a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the studio. People were cheering, whistling, and several were wiping tears from their eyes, moved by Pascal's dignity in the face of such unprovoked cruelty. As Pascal walked off the stage with his head held high, leaving behind a completely humiliated Kimmel and a studio in chaos, the cameras captured every step of his dignified exit. The host sat alone at his desk, sweat-stained and defeated, staring at the microphone Pascal had left behind like it was evidence of his own professional suicide. The last image viewers saw was Pedro Pascal disappearing through the studio doors, while behind him, Jimmy Kimmel sat in stunned silence, the applause still echoing through the studio, not for him, but for the man who had just shown him what real strength, dignity, and moral courage looked like. The confrontation was over, but its impact would reverberate through Hollywood and beyond for years to come, serving as a masterclass in how to stand up to bullies, even when they hold all the apparent power.